Hello, my delicious co-creators. Lilou here on the Juicy Living Tour in California. I'm at the IONS conference here in the middle of the desert. It's absolutely fantastic to be in this oasis and be surrounded by people conscious and having those conscious conversations, and especially sitting with you is really very much a delight for me, not coming from the science background. You're the chief scientist of IONS, and I feel we're going to have an amazing conversation. I'm going to bring some solid scientific proof that spirituality is real, exists.
I wouldn't use the word proof. Science is not about proof. Science is about evidence and gaining confidence in the evidence. The only place that we find proof is in mathematics and in alcohol.
So basically what you're saying is that the way this new type of science is showing evidence that these phenomena are real are not through how material scientists used to prove it. It's done differently. That's why the real science can't prove what's going on right now.
No, not at all. We're using standard scientific techniques. Okay. We're following the same trajectory that any scientist would follow in studying virtually anything. The only thing that's different is the topic that we study. So we study mystical and psychic experience, which some people believe you can't study, but of course that's nonsense. The scientific method is very strong and it allows us to study virtually anything. So we use tools in neuroscience and we use tools in physics, and all of us who are doing this research are all trained in traditional disciplines. So we're using what we know from traditional disciplines, just applying it to mostly to psychic phenomena.
How is your work related to Victoria's Secret? Because I slightly heard you speaking of Victoria's Secret, which was kind of surprising. And for people that are international, or living around the world and don't know Victoria's Secret, it's an underwear, a beautiful woman on stage and wearing these underwear. And so, how is that related even to science? The science here we're talking about.
Well, I was mentioning this because a lot of people know about the book The Secret, and this is about the power of affirmations and positive thinking. And what that book suggests and what positive thinking suggests is that if you think really intently about something, that you can make it happen. Your wishes come true somehow. So when in the laboratory, we study what amounts to effects of intention on the physical world. And we can show that there are effects, but they're really, really small. They're tiny little effects. So I then said, well, what we're seeing then is that it's not so much as described in The Secret. It's more like Victoria's Secret, in the sense that Victoria's Secret uses highly sophisticated technology to reveal what is actually there, but may not be normally visible. So it's a way of enhancing through technology what is there. And that's essentially what the science does, and that's also what Victoria's Secret does.
This is awesome. You have this really entertaining way to put things, and that is very much approachable too for us to understand the mechanics. But how do you actually prove psychic? How do you prove NDEs? How do you prove all these things? From where do you start from? How long have you been doing this? And where did it really click for you? Or has it always been an evolution, an ongoing thing that kept on? The proof can come here. What I'm really impressed to be interviewing you today, because it's such a big, I feel, a big important topic, and we put importance on some things versus some others. And I'm just really, I would love to hear from you. How did this evolve, and how are you able to prove such a thing?
Remember, we don't prove.
Yes.
We
Sorry.
provide evidence, and it's an important distinction because proof, as in mathematics, for example, you can show that given the language of mathematics, you can show that something is absolutely true. And science always has to maintain a certain amount of doubt, and that's what makes it different from, say, a faith-based religion. So in religion, you completely accept something as true with no evidence at all. And in fact, it's sometimes you're supposed to entertain your doubt and recognize it and squash it. science doesn't work that way. It's a very different process where you get very high confidence for something, and then in a sense the way we prove it in a practical world is make something of it. So the camera and the microphone and all of that are essentially proofs that we understand something about the way that electricity works, and we know how to work with metal and so on. That's the proof in the pudding, so to speak. But when it comes to something like abilities of the mind, which is what we study, it's much more difficult to prove it. The primary way that people then come to a conclusion that there's something real going on is through their personal experience. So many people at the conference here are trained as scientists and scholars. At some point, and by the way, when you're trained as a scientist or scholar almost anywhere in the world today, you never talk about psychic or mystical experience because science up till now has not paid any attention to it. Like it was something that was either didn't exist or why bother spending time. But the fact is that these things do happen to people quite often. These experiences happen. So many of the people at the conference here are professionals in one form or another, and at some point they had a very dramatic experience. So they become curious, well, what is that? Was that really telepathy, or was that really a mystical experience? Or am I going crazy? Or it was a hallucination, perhaps. So what we do then is take an experience like telepathy and figure out a way to study it in the laboratory under conditions where we can separate out the various kinds of explanations. So it might be a coincidence. Maybe there was some kind of leakage of information that went between people, or maybe it was common knowledge, or maybe, a whole bunch of maybes. We exclude that by the design of the experiment itself. So if two people, completely isolate them, use random targets, have objective ways of measuring what the outcome is, and so on. So you can devise an experiment. This is where science, again, is a very good process. You use methods that start closing the loopholes of other forms of explanation. And when you do that and you do it repeatedly, and other people can repeat it successfully, this is how you gain confidence that something like telepathy and clairvoyance and the other phenomena are what they appear to be. And then, so that's from a pure science point of view, that's really interesting, because now we're able to say that, at least in principle, that sometimes these phenomena are really real. From a personal point of view then, not so much me, but for other people who've had the experience, they're relieved to hear that, because a lot of them actually do think they're going crazy. And here you can say, well, no, we can't say in any given case, but at least in principle, your experience is exactly what it appeared to be. And the implication of all this, for all of the psychic phenomena and mystical experience, is that we are connected in much deeper ways through space and time than the way that our eyes are telling us. You appear to be separate from me, and we behave that way as well. At some deeper level, we're not separate. So
how do you bring that to the mainstream? Because most of the time where it starts to bug, or it's not accepted by some of the really strong scientific entities and the materialist side of science, how do you really step in there? How do they believe? Or because it seems like even though you show that many proof, it's not received, and it's still not that many papers are out. There are some, and you wrote many, but how do you really get this out in a big way?
Well, we publish in journals like any other scientist would. Some journals are more sympathetic to these topics. We're finding over the last decade or so that the number of what might be called mainstream journals are accepting more and more papers of this type. That's partially because we've learned over many years to use methods which are basically the same kind of methods and techniques and language and methods of analysis, so that you present the paper. Some people are simply prejudiced against it and they won't even look at it. And there's always going to be some people like that. But most scientists, I would say the majority, are very open-minded about these things, and they would love to see something new. Yeah. So they'll analyzing it critically is fine. And if it passes peer review, then it's published. So the literature probably has, I'm guessing, 5,000 to 10,000 published articles in peer-reviewed journals. Within the mainstream, Mainstream is hard to define, by the way, because every discipline has its own mainstream. That's inside the paradigm. But in almost every mainstream you can think of, there are some papers that you can find that do talk about these phenomena.
In all the experience that you have put together, or it's probably not the right word, but which ones are really the most relevant as to the nature of reality and that consciousness, is real as you and I here?
Well, they're all relevant to understanding reality. As I said, that if you take the classic cases of telepathy and clairvoyance and precognition and psychokinesis, and then survival of bodily death, consciousness, all of those suggest that, first of all, that the brain may not be the only thing that's generating the mind. So the neuroscience is pretty clear that the brain and the mind are tightly correlated, but the leap of faith that the brain is generating the mind is not completely true. That's what these phenomena suggest. It also suggests that our existing paradigms, the way we think about who we are, is incomplete. Because I'm mostly here, like I'm here mostly in my body, but there are parts of me that are not here. They're spread out not only through space, but they're spread out through time as well. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to show these phenomena. So that's a major challenge, because we walk around the everyday world and we have to lug our body around, and we feel separate all the time. But some of that, it's not an illusion in the sense that it's not true, but it's an illusion in the sense that it's not the complete picture. Yeah. So if you spoke to somebody who was a, quote, enlightened person and had lived the mystical sense all the time, they have to move their body around too. And yet they live in a very different kind of perceptual space. Yeah. They're much more blurred in space-time with other people, with other objects, and so on. And so our perception of them typically is that this is not a normal person, because they don't behave that way, because that's not the reality they're living in. Yeah. But I think actually they're living in a closer sense of what a more comprehensive reality is than most of us. We live in a kind of little shallow space, and we imagine that that's all there is, and that is not all there is.
Yeah. What have you been? How I was going to say how far away in the universe have you been able to I mean, how the different dimensions, the different type of beings may be living out there, our psychic abilities, our way of connecting to each other, and how we're receiving information, channeling or remote healing and psychic experience. What is the full picture, I mean, of what human being is capable in your view, in your point of view?
Well, the easy answer is that we don't know. So one of the challenges in working in this area is that if you simply take metaphysical lore, the occult lore, it's huge. And there are lots and lots of stories about other beings, as you mentioned, and other planets and interdimensional realities, and on and on and on. From a science perspective, we can't study most of that. Because if we could attract an alien to come and manifest and discuss something, we'd be able to do that, but we can't do it. So, at least not yet. So what we can...
One of my dreams too, interviewing an alien. But
yes. And so maybe eventually we'll figure out ways of doing it. But as of now, we're restricted to a small class of phenomena and that are amenable to being studied in the laboratory. This is an important part of it, because if you can't study something in an objective way, it doesn't end up being science much anymore. So the stories are interesting. People have all kinds of interesting stories, and we pay close attention to the stories because, after all, that's what led us to study psychic phenomena in the first place. But most of it we can't study yet. We don't know how to study it.
So how far does the study go then?
Well, so we can say that we are very highly confident that, in principle, telepathy exists, mind-to-mind communication. Clairvoyance exists, which means perception through space and time. That includes precognition, which is perception specifically through time, usually into the future, but it also goes backwards into the past. Psychokinesis, or mind-over-matter effects. I think of it more as mind-matter interaction effects, the application of intention to change something at a distance in the world. Of course, I'm using my intention to make my hand move. That might be a form of psychokinesis, but the more interesting thing is when there's a direct connection to something outside my body. So all of these have been repeatedly demonstrated in the lab and analyzed, and what's missing, in a sense, in all of it is a theory. Like, science is actually two parts. It's observations, measurements, experiments, that provides the facts. But then we also want to know, well, how do you explain those facts? And science has developed a worldview, a picture of how things work together. And when it comes to this realm, it's challenging enough so that we don't really have a good explanation yet. This is not to say that there are no theories, because there are plenty of theories that have been proposed, but the theories don't hang together very well yet. This bothers some people. It doesn't bother me at all. And
there's no frustration into really bringing this something that you know and really out and into the world in such a big way that it's so loud and clear.
No, I'm not frustrated by the fact that we don't have theories. I mean, we have a lot of evidence. So in terms of the facts, we have a lot of that. So I write books and articles, and my colleagues do as well, and it's out there. I mean, anybody who wants to find this stuff can find it very quickly if they care to look. What I'm saying is that we don't have theoretical explanations yet that make it easy to plug into the rest of what we know about science. Now, as I said, there are some theories that may be correct, that people are playing with, but they're not widely known or widely accepted at this point. And so the upshot of it is that if you don't have an explanation for an unusual fact, some scientists won't pay any attention to the fact. Like they need the explanation along with it, and people will oftentimes say, well, here's the evidence for telepathy. So we are very confident that somehow this happens. And the next question immediately is, well, how do you explain something like that? So we do hand waving. We say, well, it's similar to quantum entanglement, and it's similar to this, and similar to that, and so on. We don't actually know if that's true or not. So we're speaking in terms of metaphors and analogies, and if we're clever enough, someday we'll figure out ways of specifically testing those kinds of ideas. I think because the facts are stable now, we know certain things, eventually we will develop theories that will account for it.
And it so much depends of the mind that is looking, of the observer, right? Of the point of view of the observer. How can you include that?
You mean in development of theories, or?
Yes, I mean in proving it, and in really because the quantum physics, right, tells us that it depends on the observer. The situation will change, right?
Yeah, but in quantum physics, the fact of that measurement, they would call a measurement, makes a difference, is easily accounted for. I mean, otherwise we wouldn't advance very far in quantum mechanics. It's true that the observer has a strong effect, and the expectation of the experimenters and the beliefs of the participants and all that, but these are things that we can measure. Yeah. So the fact that it's a very complicated topic doesn't mean we can't study it and actually learn something about it. It does mean that it's difficult to repeat exactly the same way each time. Yeah. But this is true in any psychological experiment. I mean, a lot of times we get criticisms from people who are not familiar with simply doing standard psychology experiments, and they don't realize that human performance is extremely variable. One person doing the same thing repeatedly from one day to the next would be wildly different. And so we know a little bit about why that is, but most of it we actually don't know. Mm-hmm. And the same is true for these kinds of phenomena.
Yeah. Tell us about your book, The Entangled Mind.
Well, that was my previous book. My current book, it just came out, is called Supernormal.
Yeah, but I was interested into the entanglement because this is something that I hear more and more of. What is that specific book about?
Entangled Minds is, first of all, it presents the evidence as it was as of 2006, which is when I wrote it. And it has a section on quantum physics, and in particular about the idea of entanglement, which is both in the mathematics and now we know is fact-like in the sense that you can demonstrate that it exists. It shows that at deep levels of physical reality that what we think of as particles are not exactly particles because they remain connected through space and time. So it used to be thought, actually, it was always true that they're connected through space and time, but the experiments suggested that you take two particles and separate them and they're still somehow connected. But it was also true that when we're dealing with non-local connections, that it extends through time as well. And recently there have been a couple of experiments that demonstrate that you can have entanglement between particles that don't exist at the same time. So that's a time-separated connection. So this seems strange to us because we live in a world where everything seems separated. So how can we live in a world that's also holistically connected, which is what this suggests? So somehow we do. That is the world we live in. And the quantum reality is a better description of the physical world than classical physics, in which case we must all be connected all the time. Now, there are counter-arguments that there's decoherence and there's other technical reasons to expect that these kinds of strange connections don't persist very much. But even there, that's slowly beginning to fall away as experiments show larger and larger systems and warmer and wetter and biological systems that also are entangled. But this event, the reason why I mention this in the book is because if that continues, if that trend continues and we find that there are ways that quantum mechanical effects can exist in the body and in the brain, then somebody at some point is going to say, well, if somebody's experience was entangled, then that would be like telepathy, or that would be like clairvoyance. It's your experiential state is connected with an object at a distance. Well, that's clairvoyance. When that happens, and I expect that will happen at some point, someone will predict that we ought to be able to do an experiment where we take two people and separate them and have them think about each other. We do a stimulus on one of them and the other one will respond, because that's the human analog of what you do in a physics lab. And they'll try the experiment and they'll find that it works, and they'll say, well, now we understand it because it's a form of entanglement. It's biological entanglement, but nevertheless it's the same kind of phenomena as what we see in elementary particles. Whether the previous database will be understood at that point is another question. So what I'm talking about are thousands of articles describing telepathy experiments. Well, if you imagine that from, say, you have biophysics, a person in biophysics or neuroscience comes up with this idea, they run the experiment, they would publish it, it would show up in the mainstream literature as the first time that anyone has ever done this. And of course, they're missing this huge other database, which shows we knew it for a century that this existed, but it said it for the first time. Well, why do they say that? Because they're unaware. And this has already begun to happen. So some colleagues at Harvard did an experiment where instead of using an EEG to look at effects in the brain, they used a functional MRI, a brain scanning machine or brain imaging. And they said in the article, and it was reported, that this is the first time that this sophisticated brain imaging research or method had been used to apply to something like telepathy or psychic ability. And they didn't cite and apparently were unaware of the fact that there were at least 6 previous studies using functional MRIs, all 6 of which had reported significant effects, and their study did not see a significant effect. So on the basis of their one study, which they imagined was the first time, they said, well, this stuff doesn't exist because we couldn't find it. And this is basically just stupid, really.
We're really in the time of co-creation, aren't we? Of sharing, of all coming together and all bringing it in one thing instead of all doing our thing still in the separative mode. And
it's very difficult to do that in science because it takes an entire lifetime to learn enough in depth about any given area. So scientific disciplines live in their own little silos. And so an adjacent discipline, like you could be a neuroscientist specializing in one portion of the brain and not know what your colleague is doing in some other portion of the brain. I mean, it's that level of specialization. And this is necessary because nobody can know everything. So how do you begin to bring it together? At this point, we don't know how to bring it together. Maybe this is where really fancy computers or the internet will be able to help us by having each person add a little bit to a growing database, and the database will somehow hold the information. But humans are somewhat limited in terms of how much we can cram into our heads, and so we want a simple picture. We want a simple explanation for things. Nature is a lot more complicated than we are. If we were complex enough to understand the world that we lived in, we would be that world. You know, we're tiny little creatures, and we have tiny little brains, and so we're struggling to understand things that are, in most cases, beyond our understanding. Not only that, beyond our capacity to understand. So I sometimes say in responding to this question of a kind of a yearning to know, well, what is it really all about? And can science tell us what it's all about? You create a ratio. The ratio on the top part is how much we know, how much we think we know, and the bottom part is how much we think is left to learn. Well, one thing that you learn very quickly in science is the more you study any given topic, the more you realize how little of it you actually understand. So that means that ratio from what we know to what we don't know is very, very close to zero. We almost know nothing. And you think of us as a species, we've been using science for the past 500 years, but most of what we know is actually within the past 50 years. It's a brand new enterprise. Will science, as we know it today, be sufficient to give us these explanations? Absolutely not. Science is evolving quickly, and where we'll be in 50 years will look very, very different than where it looks today.
Can you tell us briefly about the experience you did on meditators and the impact that it has, and how you can measure actually what happens when a person meditates?
Well, we're looking at psychic experience and its relationship to meditation. We have a lot of friends, of course, who are doing studies on the effect of meditation on mental and physical health. And I'm the editor of a journal where I see these papers coming in all the time. So I'm aware of it, but that's not what we do at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. We're more interested in what amounts to the legends about the effects of long-term meditative practice. So if you go back to Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, for example, the first written form of an oral tradition that goes back so far we don't know when it begins, that book says that if you sit down and you meditate with enough discipline for long enough, that you will eventually gain superpowers, the siddhis, as the yogis would call it. So the siddhis include all of the usual psychic phenomena and lots of other things as well, really big superpower types of things. So we would like to study levitation and invisibility and super strength and all that, but we don't find anybody who can do it. What we can find are people to do telepathy and precognition and so on in the lab, because from a yogic perspective, these are all our natural inherent capabilities that somehow are brought out by meditation. So we test meditators and test non-meditators in a test of like precognition to see if there's any difference. Meditators usually do well. They do better. Meditators do better on basically any psychic task that we ask them to do. The easy explanation is that they have more practice in doing things with their mind. They have attention practice, so they're able to pay attention and do the task as we ask them to. Maybe it's more than that, or maybe that's sufficient. We don't know. But the fact is, meditators most often do better than people who don't meditate. And I'm talking specifically on psychic tasks in the laboratory.
And the brain actually rewires. We often talk of neuroplasticity. Is that something that you can see? I remember my conversation with Mario Beauregard, with the Carmelites, and how he was able to... what is your point of view on that?
Yes, the brain revises itself in the same way that a muscle revises itself, and if you use the muscle, it gets stronger. So meditation does change the form and function of the brain. Whether that is sufficient to account for why somebody becomes more psychic, we don't know. I suspect it's not exactly brain function. It is in the sense that the evidence is suggesting that somehow consciousness is out there, and the brain is a very highly tuned receiver of consciousness. So if you take a receiver like an old-style analog TV set, it doesn't pick up digital broadcasts. And no matter what you do, it's not going to work. You start twiddling with it a little bit, like meditating and changing your brain, so we're changing the circuitry a little bit, and suddenly it now can see high-definition digital TV. If you twiddle it a little bit more, you'll probably be able to start perceiving reality in a different way. So maybe long-term meditation or transformative experience or something like that does the equivalent of saying, okay, now you have a high-definition digital TV, we're adding a couple of new circuits now, and you're going to see things that other people don't perceive because they don't have the equipment to receive it. So we can think then of the brain and also the body, the rest of the nervous system, maybe the heart, as very specialized receivers that we tune through our experience, and we can tune to perceive the world in different ways.
How about the junk DNA?
I don't think there's any junk anywhere.
Yeah, no, but how about those 97% that some people say this could be potentially, actually it plays a big role in receiving such abilities.
Maybe. But we don't know.
It's not something that you looked at or were able to prove.
We're not looking. I'd love to look at that, but I don't know how to look at it at this point.
Yeah.
So.
Yes. And some other people having psychic abilities are saying that it's when they raise their vibration level to be able to receive that. Some others, from the day to the next, all of a sudden it happens. So how again can you prove that, and were you able to?
Well, when people talk about things like vibration, they're typically they're trying to express in language what they feel, and it may or may not be vibration in the sense that a physicist would think about vibration, or somebody involved with audio sounds. It may be something completely different. So what you can test in the lab is to say, okay, now go to the bottom vibration, whatever it happens to be. Do whatever that is, and now raise it up. Well, we can measure physiological changes and we can measure lots of things, but it's not clear to me at this point that we actually even know what it means when somebody is talking about a vibration.
Probably something where there's like fear and love, and being really in a place of a joyful place, and really feeling connected, feeling in the space of being all connected and in this flow and in this kind of pure state.
Well, see, that you didn't use the word vibration then.
I didn't, because I'm trying to explain it in a way that is because we all have this wonderful feeling of being totally interconnected, in the flow, where everything flows naturally, where our capacity expands.
So this has been very difficult to study, because it's difficult to get people to go into the flow and now come out of the flow, and now go into the flow, because you need a contrast in order to study what's happening physiologically and in the brain. These things typically happen spontaneously. So it's been very difficult to capture what's happening physiologically, and maybe just as the brain may be a reflector rather than the generator of this, it may have nothing to do with the physiology. The physiology can reflect that you're in a flow state, but that's not what caused it in the first place. Maybe it has something to do with consciousness. And so the consciousness expands, say, and it touches another consciousness, and that then generates a physiological state that we call flow. And it may generate emotional responses and all kinds of other things, but we don't know where the causal arrow points on this. So, and many questions of the type that you're likely to ask, and I've already asked, the true question is we don't know yet, because we haven't been able to study it in a systematic way.
Well, thank you for making it clear, because I know a lot of people watching, and some are, of course, more or less advanced scientifically, but these are the questions that a lot of us are asking ourselves, and that's where we're trying to reach to science, for evidence. Tell us about some of the things in your latest book. Tell us about the title. I haven't read it. Tell us more.
The title is Supernormal Science, Yoga, and the Evidence for Extraordinary Psychic Abilities. So the first third of the book is basically asks and then answers the question, was Buddha just a nice guy? And the question arises because, from a secular Western viewpoint, that the miracles associated with Buddha and Jesus and Moses and Muhammad and all the rest of them, those miracles we look at and kind of laugh at it. We imagine that they're superstition and they're hagiography, they're the embellished lives of the saints. And a very religious person may believe them, but a lot of people look at those things like levitating Buddha surrounded by flame, all that stuff. That's like just a story, and we don't really believe it. So if you ask scientists today, mostly neuroscientists, who talk to the Dalai Lama about this stuff, they would come away from a discussion about Buddhism that Buddha was a nice guy. That's all. It still begs the question of, well, why does his teachings last for 3,000 years? And where do these miracle stories come from in the first place? if you start chopping away at the miracle stories and categorize it for what we know today, mostly they're various kinds of psychic phenomena, or what the yogis would say, they're siddhis. Every culture talks about siddhis. They all talk about the same things. Every different religion, every culture throughout history, shamans talk about it. It's the same stuff. So is it all superstition or not? So that's the question. I would then say, well, how would we answer that question given the methods that we have today? Well, we use science to do that. That's what it's good for, or good at. And that then is an opening for, let's look at what the evidence actually is. For not for the miracles of Buddha, but just in principle. He demonstrated telepathy, he demonstrated mind over matter effects, and so on. Is there any evidence for that? Well, yeah, there's a gigantic evidence for that. So I go through that all. And then the last part of the book is then talking a little bit about theory, about what, not so much theory, but the implications of the ancient stories being real. So again, we need to moderate how much of the ancient stories we accept, because everything's embellished over time. But if any of it is true, even to a very tiny little degree, that is a radically important change for the way that science currently sees the world. It changes it in a dramatic and important way, because the scientific model has developed in such a way that we live in a mechanical universe, essentially, where there is no meaning, and things happen randomly, and there's no purpose to anything. So if people absorb that as this is the truth, they will treat each other as though there's no meaning and everything falls apart and is pointless. That leads to depression, that leads to greed, it leads to all of the things that we see that are basically destroying the planet. If that model is wrong, as the ancient literature says, and as what the evidence now says as well, we need to revise our model because we're behaving in the wrong way. It's like we were told that you are a certain way and that's wrong. So you need to change your behavior because that's actually not who you are. So what I'm trying to do in the book then is to say that we have this ancient wisdom about ways of living and who you are and so on. These have been conflated with religion. In a modern secular world, we look at religion and say, this is stupid. Like a lot of the people who follow the Bible, for example, literally, that's not very smart. I mean, there are a lot of reasons that it's not true. We know it's not true. Things like the world being 6,000 years old, that's not the case. So how then, what we end up doing then is throwing out everything about religion. And then we try to start over again. Well, what we're doing is not working too well. So what we need to do is look back at all of this lore, and I'm specifically focusing on yoga because so many people do it now. I may not know the origins of yoga, so I talk about that too. But if we went back and studied this in detail, without the religious overlay on it, what can we learn from that would actually be useful now and also inform our science? Turns out there is something there.
It seems like when we look deeply into religion, time and space, it comes back to down that time and space just not exist.
It's not so much time and space as in some religions, personalized religions, like the Judeo-Christian theme and Islam as well. Those religions personalize a god. It like takes the father figure and inflates it into there is someone looking after you, someone controlling what's happening. That's, as a psychotherapist or a psychiatrist might say, it's a kind of an infantile projection of the father figure. Yeah. Is there literally a father figure there? That's really the question that we need to ask. But and I would think most scientists would say probably not. But is there some form of intelligence that is beyond us? I think the evidence is beginning to point that maybe there is. And this is not then said in support of any particular religion. It simply says that the more we begin to study about the way that things hang together, and especially our capacities that we don't pay much attention to, like psychic and mystical states, people who have paid a lot of attention to that start coming away with the idea that there's a lot more going on than what we normally see. And so it would not be prudent to exclude the possibility that there's intelligence somehow saturating throughout the universe. The form of that intelligence and whether it even fits what we think of as religious ideas, we don't know yet. But the possibility arises that there's something.
But what I meant by my question or by what I said is that it seems like the religion are protecting in some way by what the story, the fact that at the core of it really and what is there is that time and space does not exist. And then there's all those, there's layers and layers on top of that, but there's this beautiful truth that is there at the core, that time and space doesn't, and that's where it meets science really, or the type of science what you're looking at, right?
Yeah, well, again, our science is completely conventional. It's the topic that's different.
Yes, sorry.
Yeah.
I'm still coming from that separated mind.
Yeah, no, it's important to emphasize that, because if someone thought that we're doing a different kind of science, well, it's not science anymore.
Yes.
It's conventional.
Yes.
So
Just we had a tendency to label materialist science
and what we're doing is materialist as well.
Yes.
I mean, what we can do, we measure matter. That's what we can measure.
Yes.
What's also important to say is that our conception of matter, our understanding of matter has radically changed in the last century.
Yes.
It will continue to radically change.
Yes.
I mean, you think about the upset, how long it took for people to begin to accept that non-locality was a real property of the universe.
Yes.
Physicists did not like this at all.
Yeah.
They were kicking and screaming for decades, who trying to get rid of it. And there's still many physicists who say, you know what, we don't need all that spooky stuff. We can revise our sense of reality into conventional ways if we do these little tricks. I think they're wrong, because the empirical evidence is pretty strong now that these non-local effects are real, but we've just scratched the surface.
Yeah.
So this is, again, why I look back at this ancient yogic literature, which is kind of describing something like that. It's what the mystics are describing, you know, this holistic thing that's not in space-time, and we're stuck with our language, and we can only talk about it so much. So our language will evolve, our concepts will evolve. If we had
history in the past will evolve.
Maybe the past may not be as fixed as we think it is. Yeah. And so if we did the same interview 50 years from now, the story that we're able to tell and the language that we're using will be very different. So 50 years before now, we wouldn't have not used the word non-local. We wouldn't have used the word entanglement. These, you know, we'd use it in a different meaning. Well, that will change. Yeah. And the speed of change is accelerating, so maybe it's not 50 years, maybe it's 10 years from now. We'll talk about this, well, oh, the discovery of blah, blah is now able to account for this thing that we didn't know existed.
What would you like to leave us with?
Supernormal is in all bookstores now. Before Supernormal came out, it was on Amazon.com. It was ranked number one on 6 different categories. So the categories are, you can look at books on history of religion and science and religion, those kinds of things. So it seems to be doing well, and people who have read it so far seem to like it. So
That's a good source.
Yeah, I mean, it's both a source for understanding yoga and meditation better, and it's very dramatically different from people practicing yoga now are doing a quasi-spiritual form of aerobics, which is fine. I mean, it actually works. It's good for us. But it's not what yoga was all about. It's not what the original idea was. I also should say that people who do yoga and meditation as a group are much more open to these kinds of phenomena than people who don't. Now, this is partially temperamental. Not everybody's attracted to yoga. So there's a little bit of confound there, but it's also because people who do these practices start to encounter them, and you can't deny your own experience, so it becomes real for them.
Yes. Thank you very much for this conversation and taking the time. I know now Dr. Eben Alexander is speaking, so I'll let you go so you can enjoy this wonderful speak. And if you haven't seen the Eben Alexander or read the book, please go and check on YouTube Eben Alexander Lilou, and you'll find easily that video, which is a beautiful video, beautiful testimonial of an amazing NDE of a neuroscientist that has studied at Harvard and has trained many other neuroscientists to operate the brain. And now here his brain turns off and has this amazing experience. So thank you so much anyway for this conversation, and I wish you an amazing conference. Thank you.
Thank you.
Big kisses, my juicy co-creators. Thank you for sharing this video, and I send you much, much love from California. Bye.